Taking time for your local Farm News Week in Review for January 9th on Little Falls Radio. South Africa has agreed to end its trade ban on U.S. poultry, pork, and beef after years of negotiations and a recent ultimatum from President Barack Obama. This according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Obama gave South Africa until New Year's Eve to remove the multi-year bans it had put on U.S. poultry, beef, and pork. If the country refused, Obama said that the United States would revoke its agricultural benefits, including duty-free exports under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, also known as AGOA. Negotiations continued, however, and now, 7 days later, South Africa has agreed to meet the president's demands. Under the agreement, the U.S. may export as much as 65,000 metric tons of chicken to South Africa annually, with incremental increases in subsequent years. In the case of future avian influenza outbreaks in the United States, South Africa must regionalize any trade bans on poultry imports to the United States that are affected, as opposed to instituting blanket bans as it has done in the past. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the agreement will allow South Africa to reserve a portion of its new trade in U.S. poultry for historically disadvantaged importers. The two groups and other chicken industry stakeholders worked with the U.S. Trade Representative's office and the South African government to finalize an agreement on U.S. poultry back in June. The Paris Agreement, as it was called, required South Africa to ease its ban on poultry, a policy South Africa says it enacted to protect its food supply from avian influenza and, more recently, salmonella, as well as its anti-dumping duties that were imposed on U.S. chicken in 2000. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. poultry, pork, and beef exports to South Africa could generate $75 million of shipments annually. The House will vote next week on whether to kill the Obama administration's Waters of the United States rule as GOP leaders seek to make a case to voters for electing a Republican president. The disapproval resolution passed the Senate in November on a vote of 53 to 44, well short of the two-thirds majority necessary to overturn a certain presidential veto. The WOTUS measure, which is expected on the House floor on Wednesday, is one of a series of anti-regulation bills that House Republicans are forcing votes on this month. This week, the House voted to repeal Obamacare and passed a bill that would set up a commission to make recommendations on what it considers obsolete or unnecessary regulations that should be eliminated. Another bill the House passed is aimed at curbing the development of consent decrees and settlement agreements that lead to new regulations. The disapproval resolution, which would simply kill the WOTUS rule, required only a simple majority to pass the Senate. The WOTUS rule, which took effect in August, is supposed to clarify what streams, ponds, wetlands, ditches, and other features are regulated under the Clean Water Act. But courts have blocked the rule's enforcement nationwide, while legal challenges to it are considered. The Campbell Soup Company says it will start labeling its products for the presence of biotech ingredients, a landmark break from the rest of the conventional food industry. Campbell made clear that it still supported the use of genetic engineering in agriculture, but said that there is a need for national labeling standards that would preempt state standards. Until now, the industry has been largely united in its resistance to including genetically modified organisms, also known as GMOs, language on labels, preferring to disclose biotech ingredients through the newly developed Smart Label system that provides the information through smartphone codes and on the internet. The company said it would seek guidance from the FDA and approval by the USDA for its labeling plans. The company posted an example of the language it plans to use, partially produced with genetic engineering, which would be accompanied by a link to a company website. The U.S. House last summer passed legislation that would preempt state GMO labeling laws, but some Senate Democrats blocked any such provision from being added to the fiscal 2016 omnibus spending bill that passed in December. Leaders of the Senate Agriculture Committee have said they would renew efforts to pass a preemption bill this year, and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack has said he wants to find a compromise that both sides can accept. The ranking Democrat on the Senate committee, Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, has said that a compromise bill would have to include a mandatory disclosure requirement. industry officials remain in discussions about a path forward. The latest edition of federal dietary advice isn't drawing unanimous support, but reaction from most quarters has been largely positive. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, released this week, will govern federal food policy for the next 5 years, so this week was a big week in the health and nutrition communities. While there had been talk about potential landmark changes from the previous document, while the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was meeting, that talk has been largely quashed. While past editions of the guidelines have gotten into specific recommendations on how much of a particular nutrient to consume, this version is focused more on a broader dietary patterns. Marina Smith, Senior Advisor for Science and Consumer Insights for the International Food Information Council Foundation, says that this is a good thing, allowing Americans to adapt the guidelines to their own individual diets. While the changes in the new guidelines are not substantial, perhaps the most notable is language concerning added sugars. The document recommends limiting added sugars to 10% of daily caloric intake, down from the 13% currently making up American diets. In a statement, the Sugar Association said the recommendation lacks scientific backing. As young as the new guidelines are, they are already facing their first big legal scrutiny. On Wednesday, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, advocates for a plant-based diet, announced a lawsuit against the USDA and HHS, alleging that the two departments allowed food industry lobbying to impact the DGAC's cholesterol recommendations. The group, which otherwise praised the guidelines in a Thursday release, said some DGAC members came from institutions that were funded by the egg industry, and studies that were egg industry funded were used in deciding to no longer offer a recommendation on dietary cholesterol. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture is about to print its popular statewide Minnesota Grown Directory of farms and farmers markets selling directly to consumers. There is still time for Minnesota producers who grow or raise products and those selling directly to consumers to list in the directory. The membership deadline is January 31st. For only $60, farmers receive a year's worth of advertising in both online and print. This includes access to other Great Minnesota Growin' member-only benefits, like the use of the trademarked logo and free stickers, price cards, and other promotional items. The 2015 edition of the Minnesota Growin' Directory had a record-breaking 1,027 farms and farmers markets, which the Department of Agriculture aims to exceed this year. This April, 155,000 copies of the directory will be distributed statewide at tourist centers, libraries, chambers of commerce, farms, and retailers. The online directory of Minnesota Grown is extremely popular and has had over 300,000 unique annual visitors last year. Consumers have been demanding local foods, and that demand has increased dramatically over the last few years. We are the best source to discover a nearby farm or market. This according to Jessica Miles, agricultural marketing specialist for the Minnesota Growin' program. She says our directory is the most comprehensive and commonly used guide to local foods, fibers, and fun available in Minnesota. The Minnesota Growin' program has more than 1,200 members, representing fruit and vegetable farms, livestock producers, farmers markets, CSA farms, orchards, garden centers, farm wineries, Christmas tree growers, and many more. Potential new members may download an application or sign up and pay online at Minnesota Growin'. Simply click on the Become a Member link beneath the Members and Retailers drop-down menu. You can also call 651-201-6170 for more information or if you have questions. I had a chance to speak with Dave Ladd of RDL and Associates about the recent Farm Bill implementation and how producers are using the new programs.
Well, I think you'd have to ask producers, but you're correct. That's one thing I was going to mention is Farm Bill implementation. We talk so much about some of these other issues that have not only happened in 2015, but will spill over into 2016 and perhaps beyond. But, the new farm program, the safety net program, so they were put into action this past year. And it's my understanding the Farm Service Agency issued, $3.9 billion in farm payments, which are, of course, different than the direct payments that had been under previous farm programs. And obviously that was one of the selling points, reallocating that $5 billion a year from direct payments into safety net programs, crop insurance, those sorts of risk management tools. And so, farmers, like anything, it was a little more complicated, or they had to make those business decisions, and they spent their time evaluating it and looking through and deciding what was best for their operation, which I know kind of was also based not only on commodity but by geography.
Ladd also talked about the avian influenza outbreak that occurred in Minnesota earlier last year.
220 sites and 50 million birds that died or were destroyed. And as we know, as ground zero here in Minnesota, we led the nation with more than 100 detections statewide. And I think it was in the range of 310 million in losses, of business losses alone. That's not to mention the psychological impact on our turkey and chicken growers. But one thing I do want to mention, that was a topic of conversation and taken very seriously. In all the years I've been around agriculture, I tend not to use the word crisis very lightly. That was something, I don't think, a form of disaster earlier this year that we had seen and the industry had seen.
Another issue that was a hot debated topic in 2015 was the Waters of the United States rule. Ladd talked about how the rule has been stalled in the courts, but that the EPA is still looking for implementation.
The implementation of the EPA WOTUS rule has been stalled. As we recall, a North Dakota court was the first to issue a stay for 13 states, and that followed for a similar ruling for 30 other states. So we have it in the court system. We have the legislative branch involved here, of course. We have the judicial branch, and we have the executive branch. It comes out of the executive branch. The courts continue to issue the stay, and it doesn't. We don't know how long that will last, that stay. And the administration has not given any sign that they are going to back down on this issue. In fact, in a recent blog post on the EPA website, they have an agency acting administrator for public affairs has defended EPA's work on the WOTUS rule, and she stated that EPA won't back down from its mission.
We've been speaking with Dave Ladd, an associate with RDL and Associates and an ag policy expert down in the Twin Cities, about events that occurred in 2015. Also, on Monday, we'll have more with Dave in terms of what will occur in 2016. I'm speaking with Emily Wilmes, livestock educator with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office in Morrison, Benton, and Stearns County. We're talking about the 2015 year, and Wilmes talks about how the avian influenza was a big topic at Extension.
I really don't think I can talk about 2015 without mentioning, of course, the avian influenza outbreak across the state of Minnesota and other parts of the Midwest. You may recall we lost over 9 million birds, unfortunately, to the outbreak. And so Extension spent a lot of time at the county and state level working on education about that, working with producers and how we can assist them. Our community vitality and family development centers and Extension also were working on that as we helped farmers navigate kind of the financial woes associated with that.
Wilmes also talked about some of the events that Extension put on this year.
We had our usual set of events throughout the winter and summer. So starting last winter, we were doing some beef program, especially in the Morrison County area, and then we also did a beef program in the Royalton area this summer. Those were very well attended, and continued with our regular dairy events. So we were able to do 2 dairy field days this summer. We did one in Stearns County about non-family farm transfer, which was very interesting. And then we were able to bring one back to Morrison County this summer, which was great. Thank you to Gunderson Brothers Dairy for hosting us there in August, where we were just learning more about what they do and what it's like to be in a family partnership and all the great work they do on managing their cows.
Wilmes talked about some of the most common questions that is asked at Extension.
Yeah, well, the most common question that we get, myself and my colleague Dan Martins, who also works in Stearns, Benton, Morrison counties, is about land rent. So we get a lot of questions about cropland rent, what's a fair rental agreement, what should the price be, etc. And then I also do get questions about pasture rent as well for those producers in the area that graze cattle or maybe something like sheep or goats as well.
We've been speaking with Emily Wilmes, livestock educator with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office in Morrison, Benton, and Stearns counties. On Tuesday, we'll talk to Wilmes about some of the things that will be going on with Extension in 2016. And that concludes this week's local Farm News Week in Review. You can find more farm news available 24/7 at fallsradio.com. I'm Farm Director Scott Colomb saying, thanks for listening.